Welcome to this afternoon's faculty development opportunity brought to you by the Center for Culturally Responsive Teaching. A huge thank you to Dr. Christine Sleeter and EOU faculty colleagues here this afternoon for sharing your time and ideas on the topic with one another. It is no secret that EOU and other regional universities are among the early responders to a disruptive paradigm shift occurring in higher education. And so this faculty development opportunity around culturally responsive practices could not be more timely. For EOU, the timing of Dr. Sleeter's visit is critical for a number of reasons that pertain to the student population we serve and the engagement strategies we need to use to catalyze student learning. First, EOU's demographics are shifting towards more Hispanic students moving through the K-12 system. Over 50% of the Hispanic population in the large population centers in Hermiston and Ontario are currently in the K-12 system. Within the next 4 to 5 years, these students will be coming to higher education institutions in Eastern Oregon and beyond. Second, in the same time frame, EOU's funding model is also shifting so that by 2020, 60% of our funding will be received based on student number of graduates, with additional weightings for rurally situated, underserved, and minority student populations. EOU is third focused on recruiting this student population as well as moving the needle on retention from 56% last fall 2014, to 75% retention by fall 2019. Moving the needle nearly 20 points in 4 years is requiring that we rethink our strategies for engaging, recruiting, and retaining students. Funding, demographic shifts, recruitment, and retention of current and future students, these are huge areas requiring a unified approach and everyone rowing in the same direction. Recently, this has required faculty to streamline curricula to make it more accessible, more attainable within 4 years, and thus more affordable by delivering college courses to the accelerated learning environments of high schools. But we cannot respond to market shifts and respond appropriately to the shifting sands of higher education without dedicating time and resources to faculty development. Faculty development opportunities will better prepare us to receive students into the learning environments that we prepare for them, and we need to begin now in preparing and creating those learning environments for our current and our future students. Again, thank you for your time this afternoon and for your continued commitment to serving EOU students with quality learning experiences at EOU. Thank you. Tanya?
Good afternoon, colleagues here and afar. We have some who are live streaming in from around the state. My name is Tanya Lubis, and I'm a faculty member in the College of Education, but my role this afternoon is the director of the new Center for Culturally Responsive Practices, which was funded in part by a grant of the Oregon Educational Investment Board and the Oregon Department of Education. It's my pleasure this afternoon to tell you about our guest scholar, Dr. Christine Sleeter, who is a fellow Oregonian, born and raised in Medford, Oregon. She comes back to us via California today. Dr. Sleeter is a Professor Emerita in the College of Professional Studies at California State University, Monterey Bay, where she was also a founding faculty member. She was formerly a high school learning disabilities teacher in Seattle. She also previously served as a faculty member at Ripon College in Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin-Parkside. She's been a visiting professor or lecturer in several universities around the country and internationally, including New Zealand, Spain, and Norway. Currently, she is a consultant to a project for teacher education improvement in Brazil. Dr. Sleeter is known as one of the top 5 scholars in multicultural education, according to a Google search last night. She's served in many leadership roles and seminal research that's studied amongst teachers across the United States and internationally. She has been a leader in many national organizations. She's the immediate past president of the National Association for Multicultural Education, and also served as the vice president of Division K, which is the teaching and learning education and teacher education of the American Education and Research Association. Her research focuses on anti-racist, multicultural education and teacher education. Dr. Sleeter has published over 100 articles, 2 of which you have with you today, I believe. Her work has been translated into Spanish, Korean, French, and Portuguese. She's received numerous awards around the country, and including most recently the Multicultural and Multiethnic Lifetime Achievement Award through the AERA Special Interest Group. She's currently in the process of publishing her first novel, which is titled White Bread, and we are honored to have her join us at Eastern Oregon University today. She'll be speaking with you about the interconnections between multicultural and culturally responsive practice in K-12 and university courses. So it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Sleeter.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that really warm introduction. And I really appreciate the committee inviting me here, and especially, as Tanya mentioned, coming from Oregon, having grown up here and completed my undergraduate degree at Willamette University. It's exciting to come back to my home state. I gather that many of you may be in education and many of you in other fields. Just so I have a sense of who's here, could those of you who are from the School of Ed raise your hand? Those of you who are from Arts and Sciences? Those of you who are from, where else would you be from? Huh? Student Services. Student Services. Okay. Who have I missed? Business. Library. Okay. Okay. Oh, thank you. What I'm going to do is first say a little bit about how I, a white girl from Medford, learned something about multicultural, culturally responsive teaching. And then share with you 3 examples of what it looks like in the classroom. The first rather briefly, and then 2 in a lot more detail because I've had personal involvement with both of the second 2. When I went into teaching, I went on an urban education program that was based in Seattle. And prior to that, I had essentially no preparation for urban teaching, multicultural teaching, culturally responsive teaching. And this became one of those formative experiences that really, really changed me. But some things that I think are relevant to this discussion here are how I started learning. The first piece in that was through having conversations with the students I was working with. I was assigned to a high school in an inner city area in Seattle on an 8-month practicum, and spent quite a bit of time in the classroom as well as outside of the classroom, just getting to know the students, and I found them really interesting. So I enjoyed the conversations of getting to know them. Didn't know what to do with what I was learning in the classroom, but those conversations became very important. I then tried out something with them on my first day of student teaching, and I do not recommend student teachers do this, but we were studying, this was in history, we were studying feudalism in Europe, and I had been assigned to do a lecture. So when my cooperating teacher thought that everything was under control, he left the room. The students looked bored out of their socks, so I asked them what they would be interested in learning about. And they said women's liberation. This was in the early 1970s when the women's movement was very visible. And again, I had no idea how to make connections between what the students wanted to know and what was in this curriculum I was teaching. My cooperating teacher did give us a few days to work with women's liberation, and then it was back to feudalism in Europe. But then I also, after I finished that experience, spent several years living in a black and white neighborhood, working class neighborhood in Seattle. And it was really through getting to know friends who were African American that my whole view about this country and how this country works and about different funds of knowledge, it completely changed. It was a major re-education for me. And during that time, I also started independently doing some of my own learning things that I hadn't learned by embarking on what became an ethnic studies reading program, where I would read works by African Americans, and then works by Chicanos, and then works by Native Americans, as a way of trying to build up my knowledge base. Fast forward, and I found myself in Wisconsin after earning my PhD, working in a teacher ed program, trying to prepare about 90% plus white students for working with the very diverse students that we had where I was in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is south of Milwaukee, a very diverse area. And I got pretty good at it. At least getting students, white teachers, to grapple with concepts around race and racism and themselves as a cultural being, and learning of something about community funds of knowledge in communities that they weren't members of. And one day, at the end of the semester, one of the, I think there were 2 African American students in this particular class. We had done the course evaluations, and we were all getting ready to leave, and this African American student came up to me after the rest of the students had left and said, I really appreciate what you've been doing. I'm glad that you're teaching these white teachers things that they need to know. But I'm also in your class, and I kind of already know what you've been teaching. What is there in your class for people like me? And she will probably never know the extent to which that completely floored me, as well as made me start looking at how, in an odd kind of way, even though I had been critiquing whiteness and racism, I was, in an odd kind of way, reproducing exactly the practices that I'd been teaching by targeting my teaching primarily toward the white students in class around social justice issues. But still, I was like, oh my God. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about what did I do next and what did I do next, but more move toward a vision of culturally responsive teaching that includes everyone. And I want to do that first with an example from somebody who I've actually never met. Now, let's see. But who is a music teacher at a community college in California. Her college isn't too far from where I live. I've just never crossed paths with her. Her name is Elizabeth Barkley, and she had been trained as a classical musician and for years was teaching music theory classes oriented around European classical music. She describes here of having gone into administration and then for several years and then coming back into the classroom and realizing that the demographics of students had undergone quite a change. And she was suddenly having to confront the fact that she really couldn't teach very well the students who were in front of her. This is from a Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching scholarship that she got. So she put together this really good website. If you want to find out more about her, actually, the URL is at the bottom. But she writes about what she was confronted when she said, this was somebody else who said, sometimes I feel like partners in an unholy alliance. I pretend to teach, and my students pretend to learn. And she went on to say, as I recall teaching my general education music course a few years back, I smiled as I concluded his observation was only half true. In that particular course, the handful of students sitting in front of me weren't even pretending to learn. They stared at me with bored, apathetic faces as I struggled to engage them in stimulating discussions on the structural nuances of a Beethoven symphony. Beethoven? Their heroes were 2-pack and 9-inch nails. Enrollment in her courses was dropping. They had dropped down to about 45 students a year. And she could see where her classes were just simply going to disappear. And she might have to go back to administration, or she wasn't quite sure what she was going to do. So she applied for the Carnegie grant, and it gave her some space to be able to reconstruct her teaching. But what she did, one doesn't actually need a Carnegie grant to go do. She decided to focus, first of all, on the curriculum and rethink orienting her entire music program around traditional European classical music. She decided to rethink it in the direction of what she retitled Music of a Multicultural America. But the problem was she didn't know music beyond the music she'd studied. So initially, she paired up with an African-American jazz musicologist at her college to co-teach a class. And it was through the work with him that her vision and her understanding of music started to broaden. She then underwent some studying by herself, occasionally team teaching with other people who brought in musical expertise, while she was doing this big in-servicing on herself to expand her repertoire of musical knowledge. She also, let's see. Yeah, this is her website, where on the Carnegie website she describes what she does. So the project, and underneath she lists the 4 things that she worked on. But she also became real interested in students having choice and voice about their learning, because she figured there's so much music out there, and students do come with a sense of what they're interested in, what they want to know, and even though she also knows some things that she can teach them, and incorporating student voice into the classroom would be really important. She rethought the process of teaching so that her teaching became much less stand up in front and much more project-based. And she also, in the process, and this is the part that often gets missed when people are thinking about culturally responsive or multicultural teaching, substantially deepened the intellectual rigor of her class, because she realized that as she was working with music from a variety of traditions, there are things in which various music traditions, ways in which they're substantially different from each other, and there are also common musical concepts that cut across and tie music traditions together. So as she worked with her students of navigating the deep threads of what is music with the cross currents of diverse musics, she found that the class became much more intellectually deep and much richer. And I've read some of the student comments on her website where they'll talk about this being one of the most difficult classes they're taking at the college and one of the most exciting. Her enrollment went from, over a 6-year period, from 45 and falling up to, by the end of 6 years, 782. Obviously, she had to get more people to be teaching with, because that would be like too much. So what I'm going to do is elaborate in more depth with a couple of other examples around these 5 principles that you could see with Elizabeth Barkley, and that I think are key to culturally responsive pedagogy. And I'm aware that Dr. Gay has given you much of the theoretical background around and research background around culturally responsive pedagogy. So I'm going to complement her work with the more practical examples of what does that look like. By purpose, I mean rethinking why we're teaching what we're teaching. Obviously, as teachers, we want students to know the content, but why? But not just what is my purpose for teaching my content, but what might be the student's purpose for learning it. And as my last example, we'll elaborate more on, can I help students see themselves within a larger collective purpose for why we're being educated in the discipline that I'm teaching? We'll get back to that, because that's kind of sort of a big idea there. But I've come to realize that it's a fairly fundamental idea. Curriculum, whose knowledge is being taught, from whose point of view. Relationships and the importance of relationships between students and faculty and students and students. Student voice and student choice, like what became very important to Elizabeth Barkley's class. and scaffolding deep, challenging learning. And simply by scaffolding, I mean building the steps so that students will be able to do more difficult work than they can do already, and then gradually pulling those steps aside so that students have learned processes that they weren't going to just figure out on their own. And I'll be giving you a kind of a detailed example of that one. So the first example I want to share with you is a high school history teacher named Kelly. For those of you in teacher education, the example of Kelly can not only help you think about what might I do with my own teaching, but it also, the question it poses is how do we prepare teachers to teach like Kelly? Kelly was a high school 11th grade language arts history teacher when I had her in my multicultural curriculum design class. She was an experienced teacher who had been teaching for a number of years. She was doing professional development workshops around the district. She was teaching in a school in which a lot of the students were low-income students. She had a very diverse student population in her class. The largest ethnic group living in California were Latino, but there were students who were white, a couple students who were African American, several students who were Asian. It was a very mixed group. Kelly, the part about purpose, we didn't quite get there. So I'm going to develop that one with the second example, or the third example. But Kelly, when I first got her, I just lost the thought. Never mind. For those of you who are over 50, you can appreciate. Sometimes all of a sudden, stuff just sort of drops out. So let me turn, though, to curriculum. I always have teachers when I'm working with, and I've done this at the university level, working with faculty, as well as at the K-12 level. I have them analyze the textbooks that they're already using. This is one page of a larger curriculum analysis framework that I use. But just doing this will kind of like tell the temperature, give you the temperature of whose voices are in the book. Go through and count. You can count pictures. You can count people who are named for study. If it's a literature anthology, you can count main characters. You can count authors, etc. But just count and see who's there. And then when I'm doing this with a group, then I have people bring back their results, and I put up butcher paper around the walls, and I write on the butcher paper the names of different groups, and then have the faculty or teachers or whoever I'm doing this with go and write on the butcher paper what proportion of attention in their book was for each group and the nature of that attention. And then we do a gallery walk where they walk around and can see what's the patterns in the curriculum. Very powerful activity. Well, Kelly was kind of blown away because she'd been teaching history with a brand new history textbook. She intentionally tried to work from multiple perspectives and had never thought about the fact that her history overwhelmingly was from a white male perspective. That she hadn't thought about it until we did this. What I then do is ask people to go do some research. And essentially, the main idea is to pick a topic that you would be teaching, say, in a month, and then go do research on that topic, accessing the scholarly knowledge of marginalized groups. And it's for university faculty, in probably about 15 minutes, you can usually start coming up with some interesting stuff simply by doing a library search where you put in your topic and then you put the names of groups and see what articles or books come up. I encourage people pick one group and focus deeply on that rather than trying to hit the smattering when you're first doing this. And then read the material that's in there, because that will give you not only names of people to add into your curriculum, but more fundamentally, the deep ideas that are within that scholarship. And those ideas have been referred to by a variety of terms, but James Banks uses a term that I really like, of transformative intellectual knowledge. You can read Banks's definition up there, as well as a couple of other definitions. But the idea is mainly that groups that have been historically marginalized, especially within the U.S., but globally as well, see the world in a way of how can we transform the world we live in so that it works better for everybody. And so the knowledge, it's both a language of critique as well as a language of possibility. And when one reads deeply in disability studies, Chicano studies, Native American studies, etc., you get that sort of critique and visioning of a better society. So I want people, regardless of what the topic is, to do some deep reading and then come back to their topic. And then, so, maybe rethink if they want to do that a little bit differently. And when I'm teaching a graduate course, then people have to write a paper. And I call this a curriculum concept paper, of where after they've read deeply, then they have to think about and write about what were the key themes that they read and how might that inform the curriculum that they're in the process of revising. Does that sort of make sense so far? Yes. Okay. So what Kelly decided to do, she read the book by James Lowen, Lies My Teacher Told Me, as the primary work that she worked from. She read some other things as well, but this tells a kind of a bottom-up grassroots perspective. How many of you have read this book? Great book. Lies My Teacher, yeah, excellent book. It's a rethinking of U.S. history. From the other one that's also really good, that's in a similar vein, is Howard Zinn's A People's History of the U.S., but everybody should read at least one of those books. And again, she was just sort of like, oh my goodness. So she first became aware of the power of curriculum for her students when she decided to take something that she was going to be teaching tomorrow, I think. And it was an event, a historical event, looked at how the textbook was teaching that, thought, not a whole lot here from African-American perspectives, Latino perspectives, women's perspectives. So she got some additional readings and brought them into the classroom. The students in her classes normally work in small groups anyway, so she had them in small groups. And by opening up whose voices were in the curriculum, she had a lot more participation than she usually does. So she came, I didn't know she was going to do this. She came into my classroom before class and said, I've got to tell you what happened. And she said, the students were so much more engaged. I think we're on to something here. Okay. So the unit that she developed for my class was on women whose stories aren't in the text. The women who she decided to have students study are the following. Susan LaFleche, who was a Native American woman in Nebraska who went to, I think it was Harvard University, became a medical doctor, and then went back and worked on the reservation as a doctor. Zora Neale Hurston, who is an African American writer. She initially trained as an anthropologist, who became a very well-known novelist during the 1920s, 1930s. Jesse Lopez de la Cruz, who worked with the United Farm Workers with Cesar Chavez, probably not the best choice in the world. Dolores Huerta, there's a lot more information about her, but we learn these things as we go. Georgia O'Keeffe, the painter that probably everybody's somewhat familiar with. Marian Anderson, African-American opera singer, and the first African-American to sing at Carnegie Hall in New York. Helen Keller, who Kelly picked because Helen Keller is usually taught about for being blind and deaf and being quite remarkable in what she does, but usually isn't taught about for her socialist activism. But she had become very concerned about why people who are poor disproportionately experience disabilities, and then became very active as a social activist on behalf of people who are poor. And then Maxine Hong Kingston, a Chinese-American author whose work that people know the best is Woman Warrior. She's written other things as well, but that's the one that she's best known for. So this was rethinking the curriculum. Relationships, student voice, and deep learning. Is that what I have here? Yeah. I'm lumping together under what Kelly did with the form of instruction she used. Kelly, when I met her, had been trained in complex instruction. Which, are any of you familiar with complex instruction? Okay, good. It's a form of cooperative learning that came out of Stanford. How about familiar with cooperative learning? Okay, quite a few of you. Complex instruction, I really like. I actually like it probably better than the other forms of cooperative learning that I'm familiar with, because it has pieces in it that some of the others don't have. Let's see. Basically, what students do is they work in small heterogeneous groups, as is true with cooperative learning generally. Then a unit is designed around a theme, and then each group gets a packet of information about one aspect of that theme. The groups work through the material that's in their packet that has been designed to kind of elaborate on the theme. So the theme, students kind of, as Kelly explained it, go deeper and deeper and deeper into the theme as they get their different packets. These two quotations are from the people who developed complex instruction. Elizabeth Cohen, who was a sociologist of education who passed away several years ago. But she had spent a lot of time studying student interaction in classrooms and was concerned about why, especially in diverse classrooms, interaction patterns very often end up reproducing inequality. The white students talk the most, the men tend to take over, etc. And she wondered, how can we change that so that interaction is more equitable? And how can we use student interaction in order to deepen student thinking? So this was kind of what she brought to her development of complex instruction. And then her colleague, Rachel Lotan, who's still working at Stanford, I picked this quote because it shows that the research that's been done on complex instruction really does link the student interaction to depth in student learning. And you'll see examples of this as I go with Kelly. So complex instruction has several features to the organizational structure. And a lot of times people don't like group work, cooperative learning, because a few students end up doing all the work and everybody else sits there. Has anybody had experience with that? Yeah, okay. So, multiple examples. The tasks were built around core questions. I've already said that. The work is organized for multiple access points and multiple funds of knowledge. And by that I mean student diversity of ability and interests. And background knowledge is structured into the kinds of work that students do. So this is a picture that I took in Kelly's class of some students who were working with the packet on Jesse Lopez de la Cruz. And you can see one kid creating a banner for the United Farm Workers. And somebody else with some marking pens. They had readings to do, and then their tasks was a visual arts task of creating a poster that would synthesize what they learned about Jesse Lopez de la Cruz. This is a picture of some students discussing Georgia O'Keeffe. I do have a video clip that goes with it, but I'm not showing it today for sake of time. But it's kind of funny because this form of instruction invites students to bring in what they think about and their concerns into the classroom. And so these kids, as they're talking about some of the obstacles that Georgia O'Keeffe, as a woman painter, experienced, then they started talking about sexism in their own lives. And the girls were kind of, taking the discussion, and the boys, well, I don't know about that. Excuse me, and then keep going. So it was an interesting discussion. Then this was a group whose task, they were reading about Zora Neale Hurston, and their task was to role play a skit that would have been a conversation that Alice Walker and Zora Neale Hurston would have had they ever met. They didn't ever meet, so they had to read about both writers and then develop a skit. And so they did that. And at first, the boys wouldn't play girl parts. The girls would play men parts, but the boys wouldn't play women parts until somebody brought in some scarves, and then like, okay, that's okay. Then with complex instruction, students are also taught roles that are common with cooperative learning as well as norms of intellectual engagement. The roles that people commonly use, these are the ones that Kelly was using. The recorder takes notes. The facilitator, the materials manager, makes sure that they have the materials that they need to work on the task that they're given. The facilitator leads the discussion and makes sure everybody participates. The harmonizer helps manage conflict when students get into arguments with each other and helps keep arguments from turning into a fight. The resource helps find additional resource material. Sometimes people have a timekeeper and there's other roles. All of the students learn all of the roles. And this partly helps keep a few people from doing the work and everybody else is just sitting there. The complex instruction also includes norms for intellectual engagement. And here you see Kelly giving instructions, giving some feedback from what they were doing yesterday, as well as what she wants to see them doing today. She had the norms on brightly colored paper pasted around the classroom, and she would spend some time at the beginning and end of every day until students actually got these norms of intellectual engagement. So students were supposed to ask each other questions. They were supposed to state their opinion. They were supposed to be able to disagree with each other. They were supposed to, as she's saying here, back your opinion up with the resource cards, not just blurt out an opinion, but have a reason why. They were supposed to challenge each other. And it's that kind of thinking, then, that complex instruction teaches students to do in the context of cooperative learning. So Kelly was already pretty good with that. She just hadn't thought about doing it with a multicultural curriculum. What was really interesting to me when I went in and watched her class was to watch how the students started going deeper and deeper into the whole question of what is history. They started off about wanting to know just about these individual women, but as about halfway through the unit, when they had worked through about half of the packets, then they started asking, well, okay, if these women aren't in the textbook, because they'd grown up learning that everything in the textbook, it's true and it's important. And so if it's not in the textbook, it's either not true or it's not important. And so why were these women not in the textbook? And so I'll play for you just a short clip of a discussion in which they went deeper than that question.
That's not society as a whole. That's just one question. You guys, question. Okay. Just yes or no. Should authors be in the history book? If they affect the whole nation, yes.
I don't know.
And if they should, why?
I'm going to have to think about
Should there be a whole separate book that just talks about a bunch of authors?
There are the greatest author in the past.
So why are they in there? When other people that...
This is history.
No, wait.
John,
I don't listen to her. Hold on.
I'm listening.
But wait, if there's other people out there, like she said, actually doing something good, why are they not in there? And why is Moby Dick in there?
Because nobody cares.
It has to be something significant.
Well, really, you can write about anything. What did he write about? He didn't do anything. And history is about everything, not just politics, not just writing. It's a variety of stuff.
There is another question, guys. What is history about?
You don't. Then why do you make it?
You look up history? Look it up, please. Okay, you guys, ethnicity.
This specifies U.S. history.
It's about
things that happen in the U.S.
Immigration.
Immigration and politics.
Well, just break it down. Break it down. Politics, immigration, laws, acts.
That's all politics.
What else? Who cares? Just break it down. What else is history about?
Well, I guess you're going to have to put writing and art.
Art, literature.
Yeah.
What else?
Economics.
What else is it about? Change. It's about change. Racism.
Evolution.
Huh? Evolution. What else is it about?
History. A chronological record of significant events.
Significant. What are significant?
As affecting a nation or institution. Affecting the whole nation.
affecting the whole nation.
This particular example, I was fascinated because I've never seen kids, even at the university level, start to ask about the very nature of a discipline. And I just thought it was so fascinating to watch that that's where this kind of teaching was getting these kids to go. But the teaching also helped the students begin to claim history. This is a picture of the group when they were presenting the next day. And they explained that they had gone back and thought about all of these women they were studying and who they were and what they had done. And they realized that people like themselves have made history, and they have a right to know who these people were and what they have done. Then the students also started asking, like, who writes history books? Has a woman ever written a history book? Has a Mexican ever written a history book? And really important, I think, questions that expand, you know, the bounds of what is possible to know. There's these bullet points here, but students did get a deeper understanding of what history is. They were asking a lot of questions, and by the end of the year, this was an AP class. Kelly's in a fairly low-income school, so the pass rates have never been very high. But this semester, the pass rates doubled. And Kelly said, based on the kind of teaching that she was doing, this was intellectually a much more engaging and rigorous way to be teaching history. Any questions about Kelly before I go on to another example?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
It's just more of an observation. The video that you showed, what year was that video shot?
Oh boy, it's getting kind of, it's probably about 1999, 2000, something like that.
What's interesting is none of those students said the word "like" in their vernacular. And they also didn't end their sentences with the rhetorical right, which has invaded modern vernacular as well. And I think that's
Oh, that's funny. No, nobody's ever pointed that out about that video. Thank you for that.
One like used by any of those students, and I guarantee there'd be about 50.
Interesting, yeah, because, yeah, with my students, like...
Just an observation.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, too, is this was actually right before teachers had to teach to the state standards. Kelly still would have been able to do the same thing, but it would have been a few more hoops. I'm going to be tomorrow doing a workshop where I more unpack the teaching process that I've elaborated on in my book, Unstandardizing Curriculum. But the basic idea, are any of you familiar with Wiggins and McTighe backward design? Okay, the basic idea, okay, for those of you who are, we take a central core idea that you're teaching and then deepen that idea by building on the transformative intellectual knowledge, the funds of knowledge that students bring into the classroom. I make the class think about the intellectual rigor that they're offering students and try to get them to raise that intellectual rigor. We think about making assessment of learning something that's culturally relevant and useful, so it's not all just giving tests and then everybody just goes on. And then what kinds of resources you can use, and we spend quite a bit of time on the teacher's beliefs because our own beliefs drive a lot of what we do in the classroom. Okay, let me go on to actually, this is the third example. I went to California State University, Monterey Bay, as a founding faculty member in 1995. And this was the vision of the university that I went for. Actually, it was sort of funny, the other day I had a meeting with some of my previous founding faculty colleagues. I'm retired, they're retired or retiring. And we talked about how the vision was what really brought us there. And a lot of it being the emphasis on culturally responsive pedagogy, the emphasis on curriculum, the emphasis on helping historically working class students who are largely Latino become leaders. One of my jobs was to collaboratively with other people, but then be the head of, design and run the Master of Arts in Education program. And so there were a couple of things that we thought about in putting it together. And this more gets at the idea of purpose, what the purpose of a curriculum, the purpose of teaching is. I mean, we've written about this in an article that's published in Excellence and Equity in Education. But there were two big purposes that we wanted. One was that we wanted to prepare leaders for my field is education, but you could say the same thing for any discipline. We wanted to prepare leaders for the schools in the local area. The leadership structure, as I looked around, was mostly white. The students in the classrooms were very diverse. And there have been people of color, and Geneva Gay is a really good example, who have been doing research on education of students of color for a long time. But the insights from that research weren't being used by the white leadership. And I thought about this in relationship to other fields. The other day, a couple of days ago, I was driving along listening to something on NPR where they were talking about who is in TV shows, and that the TV shows are still predominantly white, but increasingly, because of the very diverse population, the shows that are getting the most traction are shows that have at least 30% people of color in them. And that the problem is the leadership within the TV production industry are mostly white people, mostly older white men who don't actually see the importance of shifting what we're doing. You could also see that with the Oscars that were just on. So you go across fields. You can talk about medicine, you can talk about law, you can talk about pretty much anything. Who is in the leadership, and to what extent are they both a diverse group, as well as to what extent do they use knowledge that's arisen from the historically marginalized communities that would be about serving everyone. So I wanted the people who went through our program to become those kinds of leaders. We also wanted our program to be an intellectually rigorous program. In California, we have 2 state systems and then a bunch of privates. There's the UC system. Below that, there's the California state system. Above that are the elite privates like Stanford. The difference between the UC system and the Cal State system is the UC system, it costs more to go there. It's more research-oriented. That's where the PhDs are produced. And as a result, there are student assistants. The class sizes tend to be a little bit smaller, etc. The Cal States, that's where the working class students tend to go. They're much more racially and ethnically diverse. The classes are larger, the teaching load is heavier, and so forth. And I read something really interesting about that a friend sent to me from England, that the UC-CSU distinction was a distinction between the knowledge producers and the knowledge consumers. Ooh, wrap your head around that. The knowledge producers then are largely white from largely affluent backgrounds. The knowledge consumers then are structured as people of color from working class backgrounds. Ooh. So then the question was, then how do we prepare students who are coming into what would be this like second or third tier so that they're prepared as strongly as the people who graduate from like UC Berkeley or Stanford in a CSU? So we decided to take that on. And we did it because of the students we were serving. This is what one of our students wrote about when he wrote his master's thesis. And essentially he wrote about it, Jesus Galindo, he wrote about his family coming for a better life, for the family, for the kids, and the hard work they had to do in the fields. And he realized that his education, it wasn't just so that he could get a better job, but it was also a way of giving back to his family and helping to empower and uplift his family and the community that he was from. So he was already seeing his education within a larger purpose than just, getting a better salary for himself. So what did we do with the curriculum? Well, we decided that the entire curriculum through the whole master's program would be designed from multicultural points of view. And these are the names of some of our courses. We intentionally named the courses what we did so that we wouldn't lose sight of the fact that we were doing everything from a multicultural perspective. So one of my courses was multicultural curriculum design. A lot of teacher master's programs have curriculum courses. We didn't want the curriculum course and then the multicultural curriculum course, because then what's in the curriculum course? So we were doing the curriculum course from a multicultural perspective. Teaching as a tool for inclusion in multicultural classrooms. The faculty member who designed that class, Bob Hughes, wanted the whole way we do technology to assume a diverse classroom. The paradigms of assessment. I remember we had really interesting discussions around the conference table when we were designing this one, that most teacher ed programs have like a testing and measurements course. Well, historically, testing and measurement has been used often as almost a weapon against minoritized people. So we wanted a class that really grappled with how do you do assessment in an equitable way and look at the histories of assessment that has been racist and classist and so forth. An example of how students reacted to this. For maybe 5 years, I taught the introductory pro-seminar course and then passed it on to someone else. And the basic idea of this course was for students to think about diverse epistemologies around what counts as knowledge and education, and how those epistemologies inform different research paradigms, and then so they could start thinking what they were going to do their thesis on. Just kind of start in the beginning stages of that. And usually a class, like an introductory class in research and education, is formed primarily around mainstream intellectual knowledge, which would be primarily around positivism, which would lead you toward looking at experimental design and survey research, and phenomenology, which would lead you toward looking at research design like from an anthropological perspective that involves interviewing and observation. We also included research traditions from historically marginalized perspectives. So narrative research and testimonial is a good example of that that's used quite a bit in Latin America and Mexico. The whole storytelling, but also working with teachers, the idea that teachers also have knowledge that is encoded more in the form of story often than it is in the form of, setting up a research, an experimental study. And then emancipatory knowledge, which the idea is research that is owned by a historically marginalized community that's using the research to address problems within the community. And it's a collaboration between a trained researcher and the community. But it's not like the researcher goes in and does the study and then leaves, but the research is actually done collaboratively with the community to address community needs. It was so interesting to me during about 5 semesters when I taught this course, watching the student reactions. We had a diverse student population. When I would start with positivism and phenomenology, people would get it. The people who I think resonated with it the most tended to be the white students. When I would get to narrative research, all of a sudden I started seeing this shift where the Latino students particularly loved getting into the storytelling, and many of the white students were, I'm not quite sure I have a story to tell. Emancipatory knowledge, many of the students of color were, remember one of them going, oh, now I found my research home. And so then we would have dialogues across these traditions, but I could see how knowledge coming from different socio-cultural points of view really did speak to different life experiences. And without broadening the curriculum, that I was always going to be catering the curriculum more to people who look like me. Relationships. We intentionally worked on relationships in the classroom. This quotation here was from a dissertation that was done by a student whose dissertation committee I was on at San Francisco State University. And she was following 4 first-generation Latino students in higher education. And these were students who she'd known since they were in high school. And what she found is captured really well in this quotation, and what's found a lot in research with first-generation students, is a sense of not being sure if they belong here. And especially for these Latino students, one of whom was undocumented. It's like all of those other people got prepared. I'm not sure if I belong. I'm not sure if I can do the work. So relationships become critically important. I think as I've sorted out why relationships are so important, it's the relationships that help people get people through the hard stuff. For the students, it's the relationships that will keep them coming back. For the faculty, it's often through those relationships that you'll learn what the students need. Like, for example, when the African-American student told me at the end of the semester, but at least she told me, what she needed, if I didn't have a relationship with her, she probably never would have told me that. And that became a very important thing for her to tell me. So with our program, and then one of the faculty members in our program had done some research on both community colleges in comparison with historically black institutions. And he said one of the big differences and the reason why historically black institutions tend to be more successful with black students than community colleges do is because the faculty at HBCUs are committed to developing relationships with their students. And so they will help keep them there and help them get through the hard stuff. Whereas at community colleges, we may not do that as well. So we decided as a program to intentionally structure relationships as one of the central core things that we did. And we would have actually quite a bit of time spent in faculty meetings talking about how we were, how this was working. We assigned every student a mentor, and then in faculty meetings would check to make sure that the relationships between the mentor and the mentees were actually working and that we weren't losing people weren't dropping by the wayside. If mentor relations needed to be shifted or changed, we would do that. We also worked on student-student relationships and building community within among the students. And we did this in a variety of ways. And again, this was intentional. It wasn't just something that just like, oh, by the way, that sort of happened. We had group projects quite a bit, and students would get to know each other through the group projects. We also, this is a graduate program, working with teachers who've been working all day. They get there 4 o'clock. Classes run for 4 hours. But we had to do something about dinner. So we ended up developing potlucks, and then the students would organize the potlucks, and that became something that the students absolutely loved. But it was so interesting to watch students who had been debating each other and sometimes debating each other about hard issues that would get kind of prickly, and then they would go and sit down and eat together, and then, go back and start discussing. And the community building was just so important. And then we also spent quite a bit of time in some of our faculty members' meetings trying to figure out how to deal with student-student conflict. Because since we had a multicultural curriculum in all of our classes with a diverse set of students, there was conflict that would come up. And how do you manage conflict in a way that it's not just the white students taking over and the students of color sitting quietly, which is a pattern that sometimes we had to intentionally disrupt. And I can think of stories, but one that I remember from my own class. I remember the stories from my own class better than other people's stories. It was a class session in which I had readings that students were doing. Some of the readings, let's see, one set dealt with sexual orientation, one set dealt with gender issues, one set dealt with, I think, African Americans, and another set dealt, I forget what. So I was floating around. The students were in groups debating, and so I was floating around, kind of sitting in on, listening and, doing a little bit of facilitating. And all of a sudden, I felt this tap, 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 and I looked around. We need some facilitating. And so, okay. So emergency. So I went over, and there was a group, and these two students, it was like they were having a standoff. One of them was a Chadian student from Africa, Muslim student, and the other was a Latina lesbian student, actually bisexual. And they were having discussion over the readings on sexual orientation. And from the Chadian student perspective, being gay or lesbian or bisexual was, you just don't do that. And from the bisexual student's perspective, of course, and you need to respect us. And so, I mean, I had to sort of do my best, like, oh my goodness, what do I do now? And essentially have each student say what she thought, and then the other student respond back and say what she thought. And that helped get through the conflict. But we needed to spend time ourselves as faculty helping each other learn how to deal with conflict in the classroom. Later, the Chadian student, I've kept in touch with a lot of these students since, the Chadian student later wrote up in a paper, no, this was notes that I took based on a discussion with her, that as she left the program, she had actually shown up in the program disliking white people because of her experience with colonialism in Africa. She relearned that it was colonialism she hated, and it was the diverse people that she actually really liked because she had gotten to know them in class and had dialogues with them about all kinds of issues. And so now she's finished her PhD. She's in South Africa trying to get a position in education in the country of Chad, which I think is super exciting. Student voice. We intentionally tried to structure ways in which students would have a say over what they were doing. And I'll just give you one short example of something that I did in one of my classes. But again, building in options for students and then having ways that students could say what they were interested in doing or weren't interested in doing was really important. In one of my classes, we had some readings that everybody was going to do. And students would be working in groups to present the book as well as writing a paper about it. So at the beginning of the semester, and I frequently do stuff like this when I'm teaching, I gave the students, I said, we're going to read these 3 books, we're going to read, everybody's going to pick one of these books. But if there's something that you don't see there, read the descriptions and stuff, and if there's something that you would like to see on the list that isn't there, let me know after class. And so after class, a Palestinian student came up and said, well, I'd really like to read something about Islam in America. I know a lot about Islam because I grew up with it. And I know that there are Muslims in America. I've even heard there are black Muslims in America. But I don't know anything about Islam in America. So she and I sat down and identified what we thought would be the best book that would be comparable to the rest of the books. The next week when students showed up, whoops, we changed it. We now have 4 options. So if anybody wants to pick, change your pick, go ahead. So this was, a way of students helping to co-construct what some of the assignments would be. The last point here about deep learning. We decided that our students would be doing a research thesis, what we called an action thesis. The idea being using research to transform something in your own environment. It could be something in your school, something in your community, but so that research becomes a tool that you can use for transforming and improving whatever. And we wanted the students to, we wanted the students to be able to do research at a deeper level than they had done before. Often when people go through master's programs in education, there isn't a thesis component. We could have done it with or without, but we decided we do want them to have a thesis. I first came to realize that it hit home with me, how graduate first-generation students hadn't seen a thesis before. When the first graduate of the program, who was going through a little bit quickly because he had some scholarship money he had to use, and so he was doing his thesis before the others had quite gotten there. And he was a good student, so I figured, well, he'll be able to figure out a lot of this stuff himself. So he brought me chapters 1 and chapter 2. And I was, okay, he was a refugee, grown up in a Hmong refugee household. Good student. He had never seen a thesis before. So he borrowed a master's thesis from somebody. And said, okay, this is what chapter 1 is supposed to look like. Okay, so let me write some stuff. So mine looks like this. chapter 2 is supposed to, okay. And so I'm reading this, and it's like, this doesn't make sense. Because the whole, there was a research process that he didn't learn. And that let me know that we needed to scaffold the research process much more deeply than we'd been doing before. Our program had these learning outcomes. This was the backbone structure for the program. And about half the learning outcomes were research types of outcomes. So becoming a critical questioner, becoming a scholar, becoming an action researcher, communicator, a social justice collaborator, that was one of our outcomes. We needed to backward plan how the students were going to learn how to do the things that we expected for each one of those learning outcomes. So we mapped them against 3 research-based courses, and then discovered, and we started building some scaffolding within those courses. But we discovered that the whole part about being able to read research literature, critically analyze it, and write a research review, a literature review, was students weren't getting that. So we created a separate course for that and built a lot of scaffolding into the course. And I'll just share with you a couple of pieces of that. This is from the web page of the Professional Literature Seminar, and it is still available on the web. This page is old, and I'm not sure who's teaching it now because I've retired from the program. But I wasn't sure if internet connections would work, so I decided not to try to do this live because sometimes, you know, you get there and then you hit a link and it's like, ooh, dear. So I pasted in some of the scaffolds. But one of them that I'll show you is, let's see, where's... okay, the writing's too small. Anyway, how to read the professional literature. That's the link up there? You can see, well, yeah, okay. What I realized was happening with our students is they would get an article, start at the beginning reading it, and then stop when they got to the end. And then you'd ask them what it was about. And, you know, some of them would have gotten the main idea or maybe not. When they would write from the literature, they would pull some quotations and drop them in, but I wasn't sure that they were actually understanding the articles that they had written. So I was, at the time, involved in a project for higher education faculty about making complex learning visible. And so we were putting some stuff on the web that would take our thinking process when we were doing something and make it visible to students. So I decided to make visible how I read an article. And so this is a kind of a mock-up of how I read an article. So it starts off here with my purpose for the article. And so here I have some things I read for, why that's important. And then you could click on a link and you would go to a mock-up of an actual article and my thought processes. So if you scroll down this, you get a whole bunch of stuff. But what you have here, on this side, you have the article itself. And it starts off with me asking kind of a sense of purpose, and is this an article that I want to keep reading? And so I'll first look at the name of the person who wrote it and try to do an evaluation. Is this somebody I know? How much does the person know about what he or she is writing about? What clues do I have here? And I wrote how I think that stuff through. And then I look at what journal is it published in. I'm trying to get at how credible is the article going to be. Do I want to read the whole thing? Okay, I went through the whole article. Some of it's me skipping back and forth, look at the end, go from the beginning, look at the conclusions, and that kind of thing. And the students were like, oh. So then I had them take an article, and I said, okay, you got 10 minutes. Read it, and then we'll talk about it, but no more than 10 minutes. And so then they would have to do this process themselves. Then we went on to how to write an abstract. Because writing an abstract, that's where you actually summarize what the article's about. And if you're doing a literature review, you're going to use those abstracts. So then I would give them like 5 minutes. Here's an article. Write a good abstract. You got 5 minutes. And they got so that they could work through articles. Then you do have to go back and read the whole thing very often. But they got so that they could go through articles with a much more sense of purpose of why they were reading and summarize them much more clearly. And so then we can use good summaries to create a literature review. So then we did scaffolding on how do you write a literature review. Okay, I got these 11 articles. How do I organize them? How do I think about them? So again, this is an example with some real articles of a mocked up literature review. So that was the kind of scaffolding. Does that sort of make sense as far as scaffolding goes? Okay. So what kind of impact did all of this have on students? This graph was one that I put together right before I retired, asking the question of who did we actually serve. And what we were busy doing, I actually wasn't really counting, doing a whole lot of counting until I sat down to do this. But what's really interesting, you look at the racial ethnic composition of California, you look at, in the late 90s, the racial ethnic composition of master's degrees awarded, and you look at our program. It looks like the state of California, including the group that was probably the most underrepresented over here was Latino. Now the question of, so was the program actually more rigorous? And how do you know? Well, I'm not real sure. But I look at where the graduates went, and I go back to the sense of purpose that we started with. A number of them continued to teach in the classroom. Some of them became leaders in various capacities, school administrators, mentor teachers, teachers who had won awards. Quite a few of them have become faculty members somewhere else. And quite a few of them went on to get a PhD or an EDD. And I heard back from several of them who did go for doctorates, that they said that when they got to wherever it was they went for their doctorate, they were better prepared than a lot of the other students who had come from places like the UCs and even the private elites. So what that told me is, there's a lot of work that goes on here doing this stuff well. And for me, it's taken a long time to learn how to do it well. But it can have a profound impact on students, on deepening student learning, as well as engaging a much wider diversity of students than where many of us came from, which in my case was Medford, Oregon, and then Willamette University. So thank you, and I'd like to just open up. I think we have about 10 minutes that we can talk. Yeah.
So I have a couple questions. The first one is in regards to scaffolding, because it was a question. So I'm in the physical activity and health department. I don't know anything about education, but I really like teaching. And so I'm interested in these kinds of topics because I'm trying to become a better teacher. So, so in terms of scaffolding, which is a term I think that like somebody that has a knack for teaching would kind of just intuitively go to that kind of method of building on things to get to a certain point in the classroom. Are there measures of how effective a particular scaffold is? So you just presented there in the last, okay.
If the students get it, then it was
the
effective.
measure?
If the students don't get it, then it wasn't.
Really? Yeah. No, I'm asking because I think it matters because if somebody, because when you read this literature, and I'm not professing expertise in it, but you see a term like scaffolding used a lot. And for a long time, it was, for me, someone that's new to this field, I thought it was really not defined very well when people use it. They use it in a way that I didn't know what it was. Yeah. And so I had to kind of ask some of my colleagues and things like that to find out what it was. And once I found out what it was, there's really no, it doesn't appear, so if you're just a teacher saying, well, I'm doing scaffolding and all the literature says scaffolding is really critical, but my students aren't learning, does that mean your scaffolding is crap or something else is crap? Like,
well, see,
what's the measure there?
Yeah, to me, I want to link back to the relationships with students and conversations with students, because what scaffolding is supposed to do is to help students get past the parts where they're struggling. And when I'm teaching, I can't build scaffolds very well in absence of knowing exactly where my students are struggling.
Okay.
And sometimes I may even co-construct the scaffolds with students, and they'll tell me if this is working or this isn't working.
Yeah. So it's more of then creating that environment in the classroom where the students feel, I guess, comfortable enough to provide the instructor with feedback, and then the instructor is comfortable enough to adapt based on the feedback?
Well, initially when I'm developing scaffolds, that's how they get developed. Right. But then once I have something, like this scaffolding, writing a literature review, the students really appreciated that. The quality of their literature reviews went up enormously. Now, they didn't all have to use all of this stuff. Usually when I'm teaching, I'll show it to students. I may run them through it. I'll put it someplace, something like, I use the web a lot, where I'll put stuff and then it's always there and you can use it. And then it's kind of up to students how much they feel that's a helpful tool. I do think of scaffolds as being a tool that, that...
But the percentage of, like, I guess there's no measure of what percentage of your scaffolding technique contributed to that improvement in grade. There's no way to measure that, right? One
could conceivably design an experimental study. I didn't do that.
Okay.
One where...
I mean, do those studies exist just in terms of, like, is there a tool to see how effective your scaffold is? Because if your scaffold is, like, a big part of your teaching philosophy, and you were terrible at doing scaffolding, you would want to know that.
Well, what I would do, if I were going to design a study looking at is this effective or not, and if I wanted to do it as an experimental design, I would find somebody teaching, two different sections of a class, teaching it well, so you're not having good teaching versus terrible teaching, and then one who's doing scaffolding and the other isn't.
And then see something.
Yeah.
Okay. So then, also in regards to scaffolding, that makes sense. Thank you. And the other thing I had in regards to scaffolding is it seems like a linear process to a certain extent. Is there a technique, or have you ever observed in your scaffolding where there's a point where you can put something in there that expects an exponential jump in kind of knowledge or comprehension or applying whatever you're trying to teach? Is there a critical point where it goes from kind of building one skill to then jumping to the whole deal and having kind of upper level learning of this? And if that makes sense, like, have you noticed either anecdotally or captured that effect of scaffolding?
That's a good question. I don't have a real good, clear answer for that. I have seen, like with the graduate students, of where, as they're actually pulling together their thesis, I mean, there's some who are still sort of struggling, and others who are like, oh my God, this is brilliant. It's sort of gradations. But I think where I saw maybe the almost kind of this exponential jump of things I presented here was with Kelly students, of where I don't even know, I was never completely clear if she wanted them to go to what is the discipline of history about, but they sure got there, and she had set it up so that these things they were doing all of a sudden led them to this much bigger question.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's just,
yeah.
So the program that you were talking about sounds a little bit like an MS program that we have at this campus.
Oh, okay.
And as you talked about preparing students to do literature reviews, we have conversations about the best way to do that. And one of the things that I've often thought about in our rather traditional MS program with a research thesis is that a research thesis seems like such a European culture thing. And it sounds like you stayed with that, and I don't know whether you thought of yourself as enculturing people into doing this, or whether you had alternative ways that they could express the research that they were doing.
No, the shift was, we would actually talk about this in class a lot. It's not a document that's going to sit on the shelf and collect dust. Yeah. Your reason for doing this is to use research as a tool to address something in your community. Mm-hmm. Along the way, you're going to also learn some academic writing skills. Mm-hmm. And so that's why they had to, I mean, we wanted them, it was kind of like, we did want them to learn the stuff that people at the Berkeleys and the Stanfords learn, but not as, most of them did, and when we had the learning outcome of social justice collaborator, most of them did do much more like participatory action research, where they were working with people in their school or with people in their classroom to address a problem. An example is one teacher who had she was a middle school teacher and had a class called Teen Problems. I don't know who came up with that name, but anyway, the students decided to take on the issue of how kids treat each other in the school. So she worked with a class of developing a survey that the students then administered, the students analyzed and made recommendations for the school. And that project she wrote up as her thesis and couched it around Dewey's notion of schools being participatory, training people for participatory democracy. So it was, working on a problem with her students that became her thesis. That's an example.
Okay. So one of the things that we just talked about today was going to a publishable paper rather than a thesis, which we've had a pretty traditional 5-chapter thesis that just disappears into a tomb someplace. Yeah. And a lot of our students are doing research, action research in their places, but getting it out to somebody else is a problem.
Yeah. And we decided to keep the getting it out to somebody else because we wanted the students to develop the academic writing skills that they might not have if we didn't make them learn how to do the academic writing.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question, and Regina has been waiting. So sorry, Kyle.
It's your turn, Kyle.
I know, but I have one more that's really important.
Well, this one's really important too. This one's really important too because this event is organized by the College of Education, who is interested in how do you accomplish culturally responsive teaching in our schools, and that's an audience of a different kind than, to some extent, than the audience we have here at the university. But I think that the question that I want to ask about maybe integrates both of those groups. To what extent the K through 12 audience, because of their age, is a slightly different group. We here at Eastern Oregon University have a lot of non-traditional students. We have students who cross the rural-urban divide. We have students who cross socioeconomic divides. And so to what extent should we be really opening up the inclusiveness and the culturally responsiveness in terms of whatever identities people bring with them to their learning? And this is a way to motivate them to own and really be excited about what they're doing here. Because right now we are involved in all kinds of retention discussions about how do we keep our students here. And I think that's a critical piece, is to claim all of those cultural identities and demonstrate our inclusiveness.
Yeah, and I think that the basic core principles, whether you're talking about teaching in a first grade or you're talking about teaching university sophomores, or you're talking about teaching graduate students, the core principles translate.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just sort of one more thing in closing. I really, really learned to appreciate the extent to which they translated. As I was working with teachers who were in our master's program, and I started going into their classrooms, including a first grade classroom, and seeing the teachers using many of the same processes with their own kids as we were using with them.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So in front of you, you have some evals, and we would love to have your feedback on the session, especially as we're preparing for our next professional development event, which will be April 24th and 25th. So mark your calendars now. Same time, same place, with Dr. Rich Milner from the University of Pittsburgh. He'll be speaking on various topics, but particularly about poverty and race in schools and classrooms. So we hope you will join us then. And if you'll join me in giving Dr. Sleeter a hand for her time.